So without further ado, I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker for today, who is Amelia Carlin. She's the Senior Archival Officer in the Perth office in Western Australia. Amelia works in our collection management team and is the National Network Coordinator. Amelia has been with the National Archives since 2021 and has a wealth of knowledge and experience of the National Archival Collection. So I'd really like to hand over to Amelia.
Thank you very much for that introduction. My name is Amelia. I don't have such a fancy background going on, but if you can just imagine a beautiful sunset, that would be great. I'd like to thank you again for tuning into this presentation today, brought to you from the National Archives West Australian office. I'm really pleased that you've chosen to join in and hear me share some stories from our collection. As you know, I'm presenting here from Perth, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land that I'm presenting from, the Whadjuk people. I'd like to pay my respects to their cultures and elders, past, present, and emerging. So the National Archives Western Australia office has recently digitised almost 5,000 identity documents that date from 1900 to 1955. Non-British residents needed these certificates of exemption so that they could return to Australia without sitting a near impossible dictation test. The documents, many of which contain photographs, they're an incredible record of Asian communities in Western Australia during the era of the White Australia policy. They show how these migrants helped shape early 20th century Perth as entrepreneurs, market gardeners, hawkers, and even sports people. Today, I'll be sharing the stories of just a few of these migrants, which have been researched by our WA office staff members from various sources, including National Archives, State Records Office, and State Library of Western Australian Records. I'll share how we are preserving these valuable records and making them more accessible. The certificates of exemption from the dictation test, or as we call them, CEDTs, they're visually beautiful records, and most of them have a photograph. So on the 1st of July 2021, the Australian government announced funding of $67.7 million over 4 years for the National Archives to boost its critical functions of securing, preserving, and making accessible the National Archival Collection. A key aspect of this work was targeting at-risk and fragile records for preservation and digitisation. So with this funding, as part of the Defend the Past, Protect the Future project, the National Archives Western Australia office was able to employ 3 contract staff to digitise these documents and using careful handling in order to preserve the fragile records. As I mentioned, many of them have a small photograph attached to the paper forms, so we took special care to ensure that each individual item was repackaged following the digitisation. So this would prevent deterioration due to acids produced by the paper or by the brittle paper itself. The items were digitised to NAA preservation standard, and almost all have been loaded to our preservation software. These records can be viewed online by anyone, anywhere. That's on our public database, Record Search. And the hope is now that they have been digitised and are accessible online, that the physical records can remain in our temperature-controlled storage, thereby avoiding any kind of unnecessary handling. And this will protect them from the elements and safeguard them for years to come. They really are special records, not only because they have photographs and often handprints, but also in their potential for sharing experiences and histories of the significant number of people and their families who were in WA, but perhaps left few other traces in archives and the historical record. Before I share some of these stories, I just want to give a little bit of background to why the records exist in the first place. The certificates of exemption from the dictation test were required as part of the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. Certificates of domicile were a similar form that was issued prior to the Act, so they were already in use, and these evolved into the certificates of exemption, which included now a handprint, fingerprint, or thumbprints in ink. The Immigration Act, grounded in restrictive laws already in place across Australia, now included the addition of the dictation test, which was a tool of the White Australia policy, The dictation test was designed to be failed, and doing so could see travellers fined, imprisoned, or even deported. These certificates were usually valid for 3 years, and they allowed people of non-British heritage to return to Australia from overseas without undergoing the mandatory test. This was despite the fact a number of immigrants had already settled in Australia, getting married, starting families and businesses. And although not technically required by those who had been born in Australia, still, many people would acquire them to avoid potential difficulties on their return to Australia. So on a traveller's return, immigration officers would compare the handprints and the photographs on the certificates to verify the name on the document matched the passenger in front of them. So for those without an exemption certificate, the dictation test could be applied in English or any other European language. If the officer had good reason to believe the person tested could write in English, a passage in some other European language could be selected. If an officer wasn't available to read the passage correctly in the language chosen, a person acquainted with the language could be found and authorised to dictate the passage. Correspondence recorded by the Collector of Customs Western Australia stated that the test, when applied to an immigrant, is intended to serve as an absolute bar to such person's entry to Australia, or as a means of depriving him of the right to remain in the Commonwealth if he has landed. The test should therefore be applied in a language with which the immigrant is not sufficiently acquainted to be able to write at dictation. It was not until the Revised Migration Act 1958 that the dictation test was abolished as part of the dismantling of the White Australia policy. It had been in place for more than 50 years. In a letter from the Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department in Canberra in February 1958, it was directed that the new terms to be sent to each state's premier. A bill was to be introduced to revise immigration law where, quote, one of the main objectives is to dispense with the dictation test as a device for deporting unwanted immigrants. At the present time, any immigrant who fails the dictation test is deemed a prohibited immigrant and is guilty of an offence punishable by 6 months imprisonment in addition to deportation from the Commonwealth. The test has been mainly used to effect the deportation of irregular entrants to the Commonwealth. It is considered wrong in principle and cumbersome in practice that deportation of such persons or any others should depend on their lack of knowledge of a language deliberately selected as being unknown to them. Certificates of exemption were created and kept as part of a racist and restrictive policy, and for those who sought them, such certificates were an imposition and a marker of difference. However, the documents that are now preserved in the National Archives are an incredible record of the individual and family lives of these residents who lived, worked and raised families here. For the rest of this talk, I'll be sharing some of the stories of those who lived or worked in Perth. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shinho Matsuo. You can see his certificate of domicile here, issued in 1904. Born in Tokyo, Shinho Matsuo arrived in Australia in 1897. At this time, the pearling industry was booming in the northern towns of Western Australia, and Broome was the centre of pearling activities. Matsuo worked as a doctor in Broome, treating the many Japanese pearl divers who suffered the bends, otherwise known as decompression sickness, due to hazardous diving conditions. As a Japanese-speaking doctor who was able to understand the symptoms of the many non-English-speaking Japanese in Broome, he also treated a range of ailments from influenza to leprosy. By 1904, after negotiations with the Japanese government, an immigration amendment was passed that allowed merchants, students and tourists to come into Australia for up to 12 months. With this amendment, trading networks grew between Australia and Japan. That same year, Shinho had moved to Perth and occupied a shop in Wellington Street in what was known as the Hoyts Buildings. Operating as a herbalist, selling medicinal products for various ailments, it was alleged by local police that Matsuo was involved in prostitution operating out of his shop. A libel case between a newspaper and the building owners that concerned Matsuo's business was held in the Supreme Court. It was widely reported on in the local papers. Articles with sensationalist headlines like this relayed the various witness interviews to readers. The majority of witnesses were other tenants who worked in the surrounding buildings. Mr. E. A. Sedgwick, who worked nearby for a wickerwork maker, stated that from July the previous year, he had noticed that the stock for sale in the Japanese shop could not equate to being able to pay the £3 7 per week rent. He also stated that the Japanese women he was greeted by around the premises were the very same who frequented 181 Pier Street, an alleged brothel located in buildings owned by Mohammed Bucks. You'll hear a little bit more about Mohammed Bucks later in this talk. The majority of the witnesses who were cross-examined during the case were European, and many complained about those tenants. A petition had even been circulated throughout the surrounding shops and houses to have the Japanese inhabitants removed. Some locals spoke in support of Matsuo. When Arthur Giddon, the man responsible for the rent collection for the Hoyts buildings, was interviewed, he made the court aware that he had not received any reports of disorderly people, that there was nothing during the time that he was collecting that he lead him to believe the houses were brothels. Customs agent James Black was also interviewed. He had grown to know Shinho Matsuo well through his dealings at Fremantle and acted as his agent, paying freight and clearing goods imported by Matsuo. Black confirmed that Matsuo was a qualified doctor and that his shop was indeed a chemist shop. He stated, "I have always found Matsuo a thorough gentleman." And this beautiful photo that we see here, this is from his certificate of domicile. There were also various members of the police force interviewed for the case. Constables had been assigned to watch the Hoyts building after complaints had been received. But they all concurred under interview that there was not sufficient evidence to prosecute Matsuo. The character given to police of Matsuo was that he was a man of good fame. A report declared that he was well received by officers of the Japanese warship when they came. Another article published in the West Australian in February 1904, titled "Through Japanese Eyes," gave a lengthy description of Shinho Matsuo himself. His past, serving with the Japanese Navy, was of interest to many, and the article shed light on his gentlemanly nature, educated views on conflicts overseas, and what's more, his smart dress sense. The newspaper lost the libel case that referred to Matsuo, and within the National Archives collection there are no further records regarding his life in Australia after 1904. It's not clear whether he remained in Australia or eventually left with his wife and child to return to Japan. From his early years as a practicing doctor in Broome to the years following where he was working as a herbalist in Perth, Matsuo lived in Australia during a time of intolerance and discrimination. It's worth noting that if Matsuo had remained in Australia until the 1940s, he would almost certainly have been interned as a so-called enemy alien, like 98% of Japanese people resident in Australia. Most of these Japanese internees were deported at the end of the Second World War. Records in the Perth collection of the National Archives also provide evidence of the small but active Muslim community here in Perth in the early 20th century. Often referred to at the time as Afghans, Cameleers from Afghanistan and India helped open up remote and regional Australia. In fact, they were crucial. The 1890s gold rush in Western Australia saw the arrival of Cameleers such as Faiz Muhammad from Karachi, who arrived in Western Australia in 1892 with his brother Tag. Another wave of arrivals from India and what is now Pakistan established themselves as merchants. One of them was Mohammed Bucks, born in Lahore around 1856. Beginning as a hawker, by the early 20th century, Bucks owned several properties in Perth, including the Horseshoe Coffee Palace on the corner of Pier and Murray Streets. This is prime real estate, by the way. You don't know Perth? As you heard earlier, there were allegations that Bucks's property interests included brothels, although he was never charged, and there was likely an element of xenophobia to these rumours. Bucks and his wife, variously referred to in the records as Janat and Gullam, had 4 children in Western Australia between 1892 and 1902, although Bucks had other children to another wife. There are 10 certificates of exemption from the dictation test for Mohammed Bucks in our collection. for his many journeys to India between 1907 and 1928. Interestingly, however, only two from 1924 and 1928 include photographs on the certificates. So this is likely an indication of Bucks's renown and his long residence in the state. Could also be due to tightening of the bureaucratic mechanisms of the administration of the Immigration Restriction Act. Second-born Australian son, Mohammed Rashid Bucks, was educated at Christian Brothers College and was a keen and talented sportsman. He rode at the head of the team in river races and played Australian rules football. I love this certificate of exemption. I think it's fabulous. In 1911, he played for Waffle Team East Perth, and he was quite possibly the first Muslim player in a state Australian rules league by some 60 years. In 1912, Mohammed Rashid travelled to Lahore in Pakistan to look after the family's business interests and returned to Perth 10 years later in 1922. Then he moved back and forth between the two cities for business and family. This is the elder Mohammed Bucks's last certificate of exemption, granted in 1928. In May the following year, he died in India. He left a large estate to his 2 wives and 12 children, including his son Rashid. Another prominent Muslim in Perth was Hassan Musa Khan. He was born in Karachi but educated at the University of Bombay. He was fluent in several languages. He was a cameleer on the goldfields in the 1890s but later owned a bookshop in Perth in the early 1900s. He regularly wrote to local Perth newspapers in support of the Muslim community and faith. In 1909, the Daily News described him as, quote unquote, a cultured Afghan. In 1914, Hassan Musa Khan was granted a certificate of exemption. Again, there's no photograph, but he did provide a handprint. He had apparently travelled to India in 1911 without applying for a certificate, but was granted permission to return. So that's his handprint there on the right. Hassan Musa Khan, Faiz Mohammed, and Mohammed Bucks all contributed to the funding and establishment of the first mosque in Perth in William Street, where it still serves the local Muslim community today. The foundation stone was laid in 1905 by Faiz Mohammed after 10 years of fundraising and lobbying by Western Australia's Muslim community. As well as providing a place for prayer, the mosque also provided a home for men, former cameleers who had lost their livelihoods due to age, infirmity, or the lessening need for camel drivers that came with improved rail and road networks. Several records in the archives collection include letters from cameleers with their address given as Mohammedan Mosque, Perth. Hanifa Dean describes these men. Their last years were spent in tiny rooms inside mosque courtyards where they smoked their hookahs and dreamt of days gone by. One such man who returned to the Perth Mosque for support and shelter was Said Peru. He arrived in Western Australia around 1896 as a young man and spent 10 years driving camels in the goldfields before returning to India in 1906 when his father died. 10 years later, he wanted to return and provided letters in support from religious leaders in both the Perth and Adelaide mosques. He was allowed to return based on reports of his years of residence and his good character. In 1928, he was reported to be living at the Perth Mosque and was seeking another certificate of exemption to return to India. By this time, he was in his mid-50s. He was granted a CEDT, but does not seem to have returned from this journey, perhaps either due to age or his declining prospects in Australia. So we're moving south now from the William Street Mosque, and we come to the place of business of William Gok Ming. During the 19th century, many people, as you can imagine, migrated to Australia to earn money to support their families and relatives they left behind. William was 19 years old when he left his hometown in the Pearl River Delta in China and travelled to Australia in 1897. Initially arriving in Queensland, he worked as a labourer, doing long hours for little pay. He made his way to New South Wales and moved into retail work in Sydney. By the late 19th century, some Chinese residents had established businesses and market gardens in Perth. One of these was Wing Hing & Co., a fruit and vegetable produce market located just around the corner from where I'm sitting right now at 71 James Street, Northbridge. It first opened in 1897 to service the local community. And at that time, William and Jane Street, they weren't paved yet, so they were just dirt roads and tracks, which was obviously perfect for the horse-drawn carts, which were the main mode of transport. One of the original partners in Wing Hing & Co. was Sek Gok. In 1903, he returned to China, but still wanted to keep his shares in the business in Perth. So he called on the next eldest brother to take his role, and that younger brother was William Gok Ming. William moved to Perth in 1903. He took over his brother's role. The business flourished under his management and quickly grew to be a shop complex, joining 4 shop fronts on the corner of William Street and James Street at the Busy Bee Arcade around 1909. Later, William eventually became a full business partner with the death of his older brother. So that was him and 2 others. Not only was Wing Hing & Co. a contribution to the local economy of the burgeoning city of Perth and a workplace for new arrivals, it also functioned as a meeting place for the growing Chinese community in Perth. This is a photo that you can see from a bit later, in 1932 on the left, when it had moved into the Busy Bee Arcade. So nowadays, a dessert cafe, there used to be a tattoo parlour, well, I think it still is a tattoo parlour next door, or on the same corner. So if on your next visit to Perth, you look at the top of the building, you'll notice the Busy Bee Arcade, established 1894, engraved into the building's facade. The combination of the immigration laws and visits to be with family gave us 3 CEDTs for William Gok Ming held in the National Archives collection. This one is from 1922. William departed via Fremantle in August, and his destination is noted on the form as Canton in China. The back of the page has a handwritten note to the effect that William's thumbprints have been dispensed with by permission of the Collector of Customs, Fremantle. William returned to Australia the following year. Within the same record as his certificate are papers from the Customs upon his arrival in Sydney in January 1923. This note mentioning the Collector of Customs gives us context for why William was treated differently. Quote, "He was allowed to leave this state without his thumbprints being taken, as he is a well-known resident of this state of good repute. The collector approved of his thumbprints being dispensed with, just like Mohammed Buck Sr. So the standing in the community allowed the requirements to be relaxed." In his early years in Perth, William met English language teacher Mabel Jenkins, who had come to WA from Victoria looking for job opportunities. In early 1910, William and Mabel decided to get married. However, as their local congregational minister refused to marry them, they had to travel to Melbourne, where their attitudes were more liberal. Mabel embarked by ship, and William followed on the next. Their son Harry remarked that his mother later said, "I would not travel with him and would not allow him to go first, so no one could say I chased him across Australia." Mabel's marriage to William also impacted her nationality and citizenship. Before 1948, women lost their British citizenship when they married a non-British person. This record is Mabel's application to register as a so-called alien resident under the War Precautions Alien Registration Regulations of 1916. Her birthplace is noted as Victoria, and her nationality is Chinese by marriage. Children born in Australia under such marriages, like William and Mabel's, could also be subject to restrictive immigration practices, despite their status as British subjects. After the marriage, Mabel and William travelled to his hometown in China. In 1911, their first son, Harry Gok Ming, was born in Hong Kong. The next year, they decided it was time to return. William had his certificate of exemption from the dictation test, and Mabel had her Australian birth certificate. However, they got held up in Hong Kong as they could not get ship passage to Sydney for the baby Harry with a Hong Kong birth certificate. Mabel ended up buying a ticket with her maiden name instead, and they were able to return to Perth. Mabel and William later had 4 more children who were born in Perth. It wasn't until years later, in 1924, when William and Mabel's son Harry applied for his own CEDT, that immigration officials realised there was no record of an Australian birth certificate, nor of his entry into Australia. The correspondence in the records show that as a British subject, Mabel wasn't questioned about the baby in her arms when she returned to Australia back in 1912. According to the Collector of Customs, the nationality of Harry did not come under notice at the time of their arrival. Mabel had to submit a statutory declaration about the sequence of events. The records show discussion of the fact that Harry was born in Hong Kong, a British territory, and therefore considered a British subject, so technically not required to take a dictation test anyway. But eventually all of the children were granted CEDTs, even though they were all born as British subjects. In a scene that would be familiar to anyone who's been around toddlers, the boarding inspector described failing at attempts to take Harry's youngest sibling Sheila's handprints. The inspector wrote, "Being a child, she did not understand and would not allow her thumbs and fingers to be placed on the certificate properly. Unfortunately, when an attempt was made to obtain a print on her birth certificate, she got cross and could not be controlled sufficiently to enable an impression to be taken." She was only a baby. In 1925, William sold his shares in Wing Hing & Co. and left Perth with the whole family to return to China. The departure information on his CEDT here is noted as 1st of March 1925 via the SS Centaur from the port of Fremantle. These certificates were usually valid for 3 years. William stayed abroad, however, and did not return within the 3 years. This record from 1935 shows he applied for 3 extensions to his certificate of exemption for periods of 3 years each. And according to the records we have, this was his last time in Perth. So we're now going to travel about 9 kilometres westward from the Perth CBD to the suburb of Leederville. During the boom time of the Western Australian goldfields, and for 3 decades after Federation, Leederville became known for a small community growing within its metropolitan streets. For the first half of the 20th century, a number of members of the Sikh religion travelling and living within Western Australia called Leederville their home. Some worked more locally in the city area as storekeepers and night watchmen, but many Sikhs travelled across the state, selling wares, working in the goldfields as cameleers, or even making names for themselves as leading wrestlers. Those who travelled, though, often returned to Perth in need of a safe place to stay while they replenished their supplies. A number of residences in the Leederville area became that place, where several Sikhs would stay at the same few prominent houses, and these were owned by fellow Sikhs. This area soon became the centre of the pioneer Sikh community in metropolitan WA, and here are just a small number of the known residents. Mir Singh, born in India in 1873, first arrived to Australia in December 1896. He would have been about 23 years old. In 1929, he applied for a certificate of exemption from the dictation test, listing his residence as number 123 Richmond Street, Leederville. He was the homeowner and his occupation is listed as hawker. In 1904, Mir Singh was the victim of a racially motivated assault when he was attacked while leaving the Victoria Hotel on James Street. He was with some friends. He had been thrown to the ground and struck over the head with a stick, reportedly leaving him with a cut on the left side of his head that was bleeding profusely. Singh was tended to at the Perth hospital, where he recovered from his injuries, and the 3 men were arrested for the attack and charged with assault with intent to do bodily harm. In 1929, Singh travelled to India on his original certificate, and he then received an extension to the same certificate 6 years later, returning to Australia in 1935. Until his death in 1947, Mir Singh opened up his home as a residence for many other Sikhs travelling WA and looking for a place to live, providing a place to stay while they worked within the city and across the state. One such resident was Masa Singh. He had also moved from India to Western Australia during the first half of the 20th century, and has as his listed address 123 Richmond Street on his application for a CEDT. Like Mir Singh, Masa Singh was a hawker. He was also a camel driver, but he was most known for his feats as an athlete and a prominent wrestler in the championship bouts known as catch as catch can within the state. One of his most famous matches was against New Zealand champion Charlie Watson in 1901 at Fremantle Town Hall. It was reportedly a tough game with good play on both sides. Masa Singh, however, defeated Watson only 12 minutes after the interval with a hammerlock hold and was declared the winner of the match. At the age of 63, Masa Singh acquired his last CEDT in November of 1933. He had plans to travel to what was then known as Bombay, and he gave no expected return date. That's his handprint. Arguably one of Australia's most well-known Sikh wrestlers from the early 1900s was Bhutan Singh. Born in the Punjab region, India, in 1863 and arriving into Australia in 1900, Bhutan was an Australian heavyweight champion who lived and died in WA. While he travelled across the country and even the world, competing in different wrestling matches, Bhutan's residence was known to be 10 Melrose Street, Leederville. In 1909, at the age of 46, he applied for a certificate of exemption, listing his intended destination as London and his return date as 1912. While in England, he competed for the world's title in a marathon match in York. He successfully defeated his opponent, who was the current world champion, and earned for himself the title Champion of the World. Before his trip to England, Bhutan Singh travelled and performed with the Worth brothers throughout the early 1900s. On 30th of April 1903, the circus held witness to a closely contested match between Singh and Gunga Brahm, wagering for the championship of Australia. Unfortunately for Bhutan, Brahm managed to hold on to the title for this match. Throughout 1904, the Worth Brothers Circus also offered £10 for any person who could make it past 15 minutes without being pinned by the then 42-year-old Singh. Though he was billed by Worths as one of the champion Hindu wrestlers of Australia, Bhutan's records in the archives state that he was of the Sikh faith. In 1903, Bhutan Singh and Masa Singh crossed paths again. They actually went head-to-head in a match held at the Cremorne Theatre in Coolgardie, an early gold mining town in the heart of the southwest. The pair wrestled for the championship of Australia, with Bhutan winning the bout, thus making him Australia's champion. There are many more stories that might be told from our collection of CEDTs, almost 5,000 in fact, and each record provides a window into a person's life. One of the reasons this collection of records is so precious are the portraits attached to the certificates. The photographs give us that direct connection to the person in front of the lens, closing the distance of 100 years in a moment. We also realise that sometimes this might be the only photograph a person ever had taken of themselves. By about the 1860s, cameras had gotten smaller and more portable than before, meaning they became more accessible to the average person. Within this series of records I've been talking about today, the certificates of exemption from the dictation test, there is a wide range of styles from amateur to professional photography. On the left here are portraits submitted for Japanese-born Kinu Keep certificate in 1904. A front-on photograph and a side profile photo that seem to have been taken outdoors and on different days, and potentially not even originally taken for the purpose of applying for a certificate of exemption. I think here, if you look at the side-on portrait, you can see a shoulder that's been of a person, and that looks like that photo's been cut in half, and that sort of shoulder is still visible there. So this informal style is a contrast to the portraits on the right of Gashandas Mengiaj from the same year, taken in a professional manner inside a studio with a backdrop. There we go. So you can see, yeah, he's got some props with him, and there is a backdrop there. In Perth during the 20th century, some of the photography studios taking portraits were Dee's Studio on Barrack Street and Webb & Webb Photographers on Hay Street. The State Library of Western Australia has a few series of photographs from Dee's studio, later renamed Lafayette Dee's studio, seen on screen. The series consist of photo negatives shot at the photography studio from 1890 to 1959. Many of the images from these studios have been digitized, giving us a look into the camera lens of the studio photographers. From a look online in the Dee's studio collection, National Archives staff were able to find portraits that correlated with records in our collection. On the left is a digitized copy of the studio portrait of Lee Sing taken on the 22nd of February 1901 at Dee's studio. And here on the right is the resulting photo print from Lee Sing's studio portrait session with his exemption certificate in our collection. It is dated 2 weeks after his portrait session. His CEDT provides us with more context about his life, telling us he was born circa 1868 in Canton in the Guangdong province of China. So this is the last CEDT that we've got time for today, and it brings me to the end of the substantive part of my talk. I'd like to thank you for attending this webinar, and we hope you've enjoyed hearing stories about some of the people who have helped shape early 20th century Perth, told through the records of the National Archives collection. Perhaps you might have been surprised at how diverse Perth was in the early 20th century and how these records shed light on the history of this city. The records that we've presented from our collection today and thousands more are digitised, and they're available to be enjoyed online on our website Record Search.